On the last few pages, the author goes into the sheer violence that was conducted by all sides in the past 20 or so years of the Ottoman existence. One of the topics he mentions is the Hamidian massacre. Armenian nationalists often abuse to say that actually the Ottomans were racist all along. The Hamidian massacre, or to be more precise, the tensions before the Hamidian massacre were over a mundane tax dispute. The governor was set up upon the member of the Hanjak, an Armenian dissident group, aka an Armenian terror organization. When the Hamidiya regiment, a tribally organized adjunct of the gendarmerie, were called in for help, the event turned into a massacre. The author does not go into more detail, but without the shenanigans of the Hanjak, this event would have never occurred. The claim that this was some kind of elaborate government plan is factually and historically wrong. This of course does not mean that people were not having their fair share of prejudice about Armenians. Decades of Christian military actions against the Ottomans, decades of French-British strangling of the Ottoman economy, years of terrorism by Armenian revolutionaries, and the massive humanitarian crisis caused by Christians most definitely did not go unnoticed by the general population. The Muslim people were fed up by the Christians in general. As a result, an initial protest in Istanbul trying to encourage European intervention for the Armenian cause resulted in a riot with hundreds of Armenians being killed. News spread across the Ottoman realm, and with some people being absolutely furious, pogroms spread to Trabzon and other places, encouraged not by the state but some Ottoman officials. To make matters worse, the ARF did not cease their action, but continued their reign of terrorism. As an example, they took control over the headquarters of the Imperial Ottoman Bank in Istanbul in 1896, taking 150 hostages and threatening to blow the entire building up. In 1905, Armenian revolutionaries even organized an assassination attempt against the Sultan himself. The Armenian revolutionaries throughout the late 1890s until and into World War I continued their terrorism throughout Anatolia. As a result, violence was more and more common against Armenians. Paired with false rumors, this rapidly went from violence to murder. In Adana, rumors of the COP being overthrown spread. Further rumors were spread of a planned Armenian uprising, which resulted in riots and exploded in horrific violence. Hate-filled Muslims across Syria turned on their Armenian neighbors. When 250 Turkish irregulars were sent to get the situation under control, they instead joined the destruction of the Armenian quarters. Troops sent to stop the killing instead joined the killing, which resulted in 25,000 Armenians and 1,850 Turks being killed. A board of sheikhs tried to form a semi-official board in order to de-escalate the situation and to bring everyone back to sanity. But by this point, radical COP voices took control over the party and announced that a jihad should be called against the dervishes and seminaries. As if the inter-religious violence in Anatolia was not enough, violence also erupted on the Balkan. To quote, "The Carnage Report, published in early 1914, was an unflinching exposé of extreme brutality, mistreatment of war prisoners, and atrocities perpetrated against civilian populations. It verified Ottoman reports of Bulgarian atrocities at Edirne and elsewhere in Thrace. When it entered Edirne after its successful siege, the Bulgarian army found the population emaciated and starving. Prisoners trapped on an island in the Tunka were eating grass from the ground and bark stripped from trees. Many Greek, Armenian, and Jewish residents joined the Bulgarian soldiers plundering the city, while the Turkish population, in calm dignity and in fear of reprisals, let them carry off everything without saying a word. When the Ottoman troops did not at first appear, the Bulgarian troops came back, went door to door, rounding up selected inhabitants, bounded them together in force, and drowned them in the Marista River. The commissioners noted that these were not isolated or fortuitous events. They represent national tactics. The object of these armed conflicts over a convert, clearly conceived or vaguely felt, but always and everywhere in the same, was the complete extermination of an alien population. No side refrained, no side was spared. And as if all of this wasn't crazy enough, the violence also spread within the faith. In Macedonia during the Second War, referring to the Balkan Wars, Greek authorities killed the Bulgarian residents of Ceres with the besieging Bulgarian army outside. When the Bulgarians captured the city, they massacred the Greeks and burned the city down. In revenge, the king of Greece personally ordered the total devastation of Bulgarian villages. Greek forces systematically burned over 160 villages in the Struminica district. In the towns of Kikis, 4,725 buildings were destroyed, including 1,846 houses, over 600 shops, and 5 mills. From there to the Bulgarian border, the Greeks burned every village, accounting for more than 80. The Greek war posters published in the Carnage Report showed soldiers gleefully gouging out eyes and performing other cruelties. A trove of 25 letters from Greek soldiers were found bragging about being more brutal than the Bulgarians. But the fire of violence raged on. In the end, World War I erupted and the Ottomans joined the Great War. In the Eastern Front, the Sarıkamış event resulted in the Ottoman defeat and encouraged Armenian revolutionaries. A Russian counteroffensive began, and with, quote, mutual indiscriminate massacring of Muslims by the joint Russo-Armenian forces and of Christians by Ottoman forces. So after 20 years of Armenian terrorism and indiscriminate murdering of Muslims by Armenians as well as Russians, in Istanbul, Talat Pasha ordered all regional security personnel and government officials who were Armenian to be dismissed. Some units and governors, however, took matters into their own hands and started massacring Armenians as revenge for the desertion of the army and for the help for the Russians, which included the massacring of Muslims. A similar case is Cevdet, the Ottoman governor of Van and brother-in-law of Enver Pasha. He attacked Armenian villages in the area because he was convinced that the Armenians were collaborating with the Russians. Long story short, the attack derailed into mass murder, forced conversions, mutilations, theft, and much more by irregular troops. Most of the killing was done by Kurdish paramilitary forces, but ordinary and regular Ottoman troops were not absent of the scenery either. Was this an intended result by Cevdet? Hard to say. I can imagine that he just wanted the problem to be solved and troops just took matters into their own hands. I can also imagine that he deliberately wanted such a result. Either way, there is no question about the great tragedy the Armenian people went through. There's enough undeniable facts about it. But I want to make the following very clear. From what I could understand, the government itself was more striving to maintain order and peace rather than targeting Armenians deliberately. Matter of fact also remains that the Armenian revolutionaries are at the forefront and cause for the sheer prejudice and hate of various people towards Armenians. What ended up happening is that people and government officials started acting on their own. If you want to call this a genocide, by all means be my guest. But first, we have to be very precise about who the actors are. And second, we have to talk about the Armenian revolutionaries and the Muslim victims as well. The murdering of Muslims happened in the scale of hundreds, thousands, if not millions. In the West as well as in the East, committed by Orthodox Christians, openly admitted by Orthodox Christians. Be it the Bulgars that wanted to exterminate all Muslims from Europe, or the first Prime Minister of Armenia, Hovhannes Khachazoni, who admitted indoctrinating ordinary Armenians to start a war they thought they would win. But what ends up happening is that people only and solely talk about Armenian victims with total disregard of the escalation the Armenian side brought into the world, with total disregard to the sheer hatred and murdering that happened by the Orthodox side, in this particular case by the Armenian side, with total disregard to the support for a foreign invading army the Armenians provided. This is a deliberate risk that was taken by the Armenian side. Does this justify all the murdering done by the Muslim side? Of course not. But we cannot pretend that this was one-sided. Again, by all means call it a genocide, but unless you're a hypocrite, you have to call what the Armenians did also a genocide. And you have to admit that this is not government shenanigans suddenly deciding to target Armenians, but a result of the actions the Armenian revolutionaries and large parts of the Armenian population partook in. It is the result of the Christian world being absolutely oblivious to the suffering the Muslim side went through for decades. Now, before I end the video, I would like to mention two more topics. First, the atrocities committed in Trabzon. According to the author, Armenian children were poisoned, some Armenians were sent into the Black Sea and blown away. This is specifically about Armenian revolutionaries, not civilians. And some Armenian orphans were given to Turkish families. This is entirely hearsay. The entire accusation is based on what Western officials observed in Trabzon. The same officials that couldn't open their mouth to murder committed against Muslims. The representatives of nations that deliberately ignored a genocide of Muslims on the Balkan. But even if we put that aside, I would like to point at a potential view. Let's take the given Armenian children to Turkish families as an example. Could it be that the Turkish orphanage deliberately did that to save the Armenian children, since they would be much safer with Muslim families than with Armenian ones, especially in a time where Armenians are deliberately targeted by various civilian people within the population? The answer is potentially yes. If this is the case, the Ottoman side is criticized for saving Armenians. The second point, the poisoning of Armenian babies. I will take this at face value and just want to say this. If a racist doctor/nurse acts on his or her own without any government orders, is it really a genocide conducted by the state, or are these the actions of a psychopath? Second, this is a quote I would like to bring from the book. By 1920, as refugees poured into Istanbul, disease was everywhere, especially influenza, smallpox and typhus, and also venereal diseases among the Allied soldiers anyways. Anticipating the requirement of the peace conference, the Sultan's government ordered a halt to Greek and Armenian deportations from Anatolia and began to collect data on these populations. Besides the Christians, there were more than 1 million Muslim refugees and displaced persons expelled from the Balkan and arriving by ship from Constanzo or escaping the Russian Civil War. Attempts to resettle returning Greek and Armenian refugees met vigorous and sometimes violent resistance. The homes the refugees had left behind were in many cases now occupied by Turkish people, refugees themselves forced from Bulgaria, Greece, Serbia and Montenegro, unwilling to vacate their new homes unless they were giving back their old. Some of the returning Christian refugees were provided with arms by their priests under Allied supervision. Deadly confrontation occurred. This is the situation before the Greek invasion of Anatolia. What I want to point at is the massive humanitarian crisis the Orthodox side caused. This is by no means an excuse to anything the Muslim side did, but it is very apparent that government officials tried to solve a highly polarized situation where everyone is messing around with the people. What is also very apparent is the state of mind and trauma people are left with. You're in your full right to point at the tragedy of the Orthodox side, but what is forgotten here are the millions of victims on the Muslim side. The Turkish side apparently should just ignore and accept, so Orthodox people can feel better about their own past. At the end of the day, no one is denying that Orthodox people suffered, but what people are denying are the millions of Muslims that also suffered because of the deliberate actions the Orthodox side took and the Latin side silently accepted. This is where we go from reconciliation to historic revisionism and fascism.
Çıkayım gideyim Rum eline aman aman Arzu hal vereyim Mehmet Beyler beyine aman aman beyler beyler